Yeah, hi everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, minutes of the previous meeting. Page 5. I'll go through page by page if you could just indicate if there's anything. Page 6. 7. 8. 9. Michael, could you use your microphone, please?
Yeah, just got a name spelt wrong with one S. But it's that way out.
Okay, all right. Third paragraph, Rachel's name spelt wrong. Page 10, 11, 12, and 13. Sarah?
It's not a correction, it's just wondering about action 5 about a track of recommendations as a standing item in the agenda. It's not in this agenda. Is that something that's going to happen going forward?
Apologies, that was just missed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, are you happy that I signed those minutes as a correct record of the meeting? Can we have a show of hands, please? Thank you, that's unanimous. Are there any declarations of interest? We've no public here, and as far as I'm aware, there are no questions from any members of the public. Are there any member questions that haven't been sent in previously? No? Right, I've done my bit, now I'm going to hand over to Ed for fees and charges. Page 15 of the agenda.
This is resolution 3 from the minutes of the last meeting. Standing item of approval of fees and charges each year in respect to the following financial year before it goes to executive and council. I wonder if just before I introduce that item, I should just touch on other items that were resolved at the last time. We've covered number 5. Thank you, Councillor Kerr. Going reverse order with number 4, legal representation. We've got Rachel Lucas joining us online. And the number 1 item was the reduction in fees for taxi licences for this year, which has been implemented. Item 2 was to recommend the executive to apply a reduction to fees charged in 21-22. So just to update the committee, the executive members for finance and for environment, sport and leisure have been considering this over the summer, as this is an unbudgeted funding request, as to whether and how that refund could be applied. And my expectation is that there'll be an executive individual member decision towards the end of November or early December to decide whether or how to apply that refund. So an individual member decision can be made about that item.
And of course, you'll all receive notification of that in the normal way.
Yes, it'll be published a minimum 28 days in advance on the forward plan for individual executive member decisions. So if I may turn to the fees and charges report, it starts on page 15. Last year, the committee agreed with the recommendation to keep fees and charges unchanged for two real reasons. One was this time last year, there wasn't the inflationary pressure that we're now experiencing. So there was a desire to increase fees and charges, but it wasn't an overwhelming desire. And we were also at that point still in advance of returning the licensing function from Public Protection Partnership to Wokingham's in-house service, which didn't happen until April the 1st. Therefore, it was felt last year it wasn't appropriate to recommend an increase to fees and charges until the new service was at least in place. You'll see from the report that there is now in effect a recommendation to increase fees and charges which are within the council's gift to increase, which is important to note is by no means all fees and charges, because a great number are set by statute or regulation, and those are the ones in Appendix A, which we do not have the authority to change. The fees and charges in Appendix B are what we call discretionary fees, largely based on a cost recovery basis to cover the council's cost of receiving and administering and processing applications for licensing and for general management and enforcement of the licensing regime applicable to that business function. And there is a recommendation that we look at the Consumer Prices Index, which I know has just been updated this week, but the one we had when we wrote the report was 9.9%. I don't propose from an officer point of view that we seek to change that figure every month. The new figure is similar to the figure of 9.9%. Having said that, it's not a problem to change the figures because it's simply a different formula. So really over to the committee members to look at the options, either keep the fees unchanged or increase them in line with the Consumer Prices Index.
Rachel.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh.
Right, so I understand that that this should be cost neutral, so the income and the cost should balance out over time. So my question would be, what evidence is there that the costs of the team are going to rise by 9.9%? Inflation, normally that would be a reasonable way of doing it, but because inflation is so rampant, wouldn't it be better to actually look at the costs of the team overall, what you're budgeting for the team and working it out that way, rather than passing on massive inflation to people, which will affect obviously their livelihoods.
The cost of the licensing service that we run is more than the fee income that we currently receive. Fee income in 2019, which was the last full year before the pandemic, was about 290,000. We're forecasting about 250,000 this year. So the costs of running the licensing scheme are greater than the income we receive. I think it's a perfectly valid point that salaries are not going to increase by 9.9%. Other costs might. The overhead costs of running the council of various types may be increased more than 9.9%. Energy, for example. But the basis at the moment is that income from fees is actually short of what we're spending on running the licensing service.
Thanks. Do you mean for the coming year that will be the case, or do you mean in the past that's been the case?
It's been the case for the last 2 years, as far as we're able to tell, because it was a partnership activity. But for this year, the income is considerably less than the amount that we're spending on administering the licensing service.
Sorry, I've got Bill next. Okay, Michael.
Probably in a similar vein, I think, really. I just really want to refresh my memory on this one. That you say that the fees cover the cost of the council. I just wonder what other elements in these fees are non-costs to some extent. I know we can't make a profit on it, the council can't, but I just really wonder if you perhaps clarify that, or whether there might be any scope for maybe reducing them somewhat.
We're allowed to include in a cost recovery calculation all the on costs and infrastructure costs of the council. So it's as well as the on cost for staffing, you've got the on cost for the building, for IT equipment, for facilities that people might use when they're working from home, as well as tax and national insurance implications. So we're allowed to include all the council's legitimate costs that go towards providing the service. Whether fees could be reduced would largely depend on whether the number of hours it takes to process an application has changed significantly, because nearly all of these fees were calculated some years ago in most cases, based on an equation of the hourly rate, which we're proposing should rise from £59 to £65, multiplied by the number of hours it takes to process a licence, and an estimate of how many hours are spent managing and enforcing the scheme.
Thank you, Shahid.
Thank you, Chair. 2 points. 9.9%. There seems to be just a CPI, because the CPI figure. Have we done any detailed cost analysis which tells us exactly the detail? This is the actual cost. And I don't know what that is and what is the outcome of that. And secondly, also, the fact we've actually brought this service in-house. Are there any financial benefits of that? And has that been taken into consideration as well when we've coming with this 9.9%? So I'm just trying to understand. I could be getting this wrong. The reason we're proposing 9.9% is because this is a consumer price index. That is, but I would like to see more detail behind that, whether the actual cost is 9.9% or is something else.
I mean, like many services the council provide, the principal cost is staffing. There are, of course, other costs, as I indicated earlier, around the infrastructure and the facilities which are provided, which it is fair to say are difficult to accurately estimate per function. We obviously have data, well, I personally don't have data, but there is data within the council about costs for energy and for running the civic centre, for example, which can then be apportioned to specific service areas. But it's difficult to accurately quantify the exact proportion of the council's infrastructure costs which are applicable to an individual service, other than the salaries of the staff that you employ to do that job. I think your second point was this, bringing the service in-house and financial benefits. The process of returning the services in-house did not really major on it being a cheaper option. It was more about service quality and making it locally responsive was the main driver for returning it in-house, rather than making financial savings. Naturally, if there were savings and less cost involved in the licensing function, then licensees could legitimately expect that those reductions were reflected in the fees they pay. Although in our current situation, it's likely that inflationary costs might overtake those in any case.
Yeah, Abdul, and then Sarah, and then you, Bill. Sorry? Yes, sorry, yes.
Is it possible to compare the cost we had before and now afterwards we can bring it in-house and do the comparison. Is that information available? And how many staff actually are involved in this process who are providing this service?
I'll take the first point first, because when I try to answer questions in reverse order, I always forget what the first question was. So the first question was quantifying the previous cost to this cost. I mean, I wouldn't say that anything is impossible in life, or in the question that you raised. However, the arrangement we had with the Public Protection Partnership was that West Berkshire Council would provide the licensing service on behalf of Wokingham, and in return would keep the income from licensing fees. And they did the same thing for Bracknell Forest. So the data which I have requested and received from the PPP about their previous income relates to both Bracknell Forest and Wokingham. So that in itself presents a difficulty, because it's difficult to isolate the costs which were unique to this borough. The income that was unique to this borough. And similarly, the costs were that their staffing was applicable across all three boroughs. So it would actually be quite difficult to actually identify what the exact cost down to the pound a penny was of providing a licensing service for Wokingham, because they were providing it for three boroughs. So it was an overall cost and an overall income. Your second question, which I nearly forgot, was how many staff are involved. We've got Kieran as the licensing and processing manager, got Mike Harding and Aaron Court as the licensing officers, and we have 1.5 full-time, well, one full-time and one part-time licensing processing officer. So those are the people who've got licensing in their job title. We also have 3.5 customer delivery officers working in the same team, and it's fair to say there's a lot of overlap in the work that they do. I mean, Kieran, is it fair to say that the licensing work actually takes more than the 1.5
Yes,
licensing
absolutely.
processing
Absolutely.
officers? Yeah. So that team of 4.5, although they're not all dedicated to licensing, are doing a lot of licensing work.
Abdul,
Thank you, Chair. You echoed about £250,000 roughly. How did you come to that figure?
Sorry, I missed the source of the 250,000. Is that what I said earlier? Yeah, thank you. Yes. 2019, I indicated we're looking at as the last fully representative year. That is half of the income that West Berkshire received for West Berkshire and Wokingham. I think I said West Berkshire and Bracknell Forest earlier. I meant to say West Berkshire and Wokingham. So the income for the two boroughs was 580,000. So half of that was 290. That was the income we got in 2019. This year we're forecast, well, to put it in simple terms, at the end of September, we'd received £125,000 of income from licensing. So we're doubling that to forecast to the end of the year at 250,000.
Sarah. Oh, sorry, Abdul.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just trying to understand where this 9% came from, because you are now saying 125, another 100, which make 250, which is logistic. But where this 9% you are thinking now?
So we're expecting that we would receive in the region of 250,000 by the end of this financial year for licensing. So we're looking forward to the next financial year, when a lot of the council's costs will have risen considerably, including in the 6 months from now till then. So we feel that we need to recommend increasing income from fees and charges, albeit that it's only some of the fees and charges that the council can levy in the licensing function. And the best indicator we can think of to itemise that increase is the consumer price index, which I know is variable, but
9.9 is RPI, not CPI, I think.
I think, I'm pretty sure I looked it up as the CPI. It was 9.9 at the end of August. It's 10.1% as of yesterday.
I think that's RPI.
That may well be RPI, yes.
Sarah.
Thank you. So I've got a few questions. Mainly a big point though is that I think the decision fundamentally needs to be based on cost, because we need to make sure that it balances out, but we don't have the information in this report on cost. So I think it's going to be very difficult for us as a committee to make a recommendation which is informed based on the information we have here, because we're talking about budgets, but we don't know how those budgets have been set. So what I think we need is another report to come back with the costs so we can have a better understanding and then make that more informed decision. I don't know how the rest of the committee feel. So I might be making a recommendation in a minute around that. And I think what we need to understand is the breakdown of those costs. What is break even for this service, which is effectively what we're trying to find out, to know that what we need to be administering there. And beyond that, then I have some other questions, which would be helpful maybe in that report when it comes, unless it's easily answerable now. So firstly, going back to West Berks administering this before, have they always met cost? Have they had to use general fund reserves to fill that gap, or has it always worked out okay? Are we forecasting having to use general funds this year to fill a gap? The hourly rate cost of this service, I'm assuming that the hourly rate we used before was actually on the West Berkshire licensing people. Now we're looking at our own people. I think it's important that we understand how that's calculated, because that's how cost has come from. So to have that breakdown as well, I think it's going to be really important, because we might want to scrutinise and challenge that potentially. And there was another point I wanted to make, or a question, so I've scribbled down some notes here. I think more generally, I mean, I understand how the licensing worked before, but it was more than just licensing that came in. You said earlier in response to Shahid's question that bringing this all in-house wasn't about making savings, but in principle, is it therefore costing us more to have done this? Just generally, it would be useful to understand.
On the assumption that your questions are all down in the minutes, I think it would be best to look at those as a separate report rather than try and answer them now. I think including the last point about has it cost more, because I mean, that's not something that I know off the top of my head. I mean, obviously I know what the discussions were and what the decisions were about the financial settlement and the ongoing contract with West Berkshire to deliver a smaller set of shared services as they now do. I know what those figures are, but whether that means that what we're currently doing costs more than what we did before is not something I can know off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I suspect it's possibly two reports for this group, then one on the latter thing that we discussed. And I think it'd be very good for us to sort of have a backwards reflection and understand the impacts financially of that move. But yeah, if I could make a formal recommendation, please, that this report comes back at the next committee meeting with all the information on costs, so that we can make an informed decision based on the costs of the service and set the fee, well, recommend what the fee should be on that for it to be decided at full council. Is that okay as a recommendation?
Can I give a response to just on the, it's just on the Office of Practicalities. It's an unusual position where the local authority is effectively separated away from the public protection partnership. So I think my Ofsted has described how there are figures available and how the West Berkshire element and Woking Melon were split, and there was an appropriation to the funds that come in. So those figures have influenced the cost for the service in terms of the staff and what we need to run for the service here as Wokingham. But the reality is that was an entire project that was led prior to myself arriving, as a project to break away from the PPP, and they had to make decisions where they wouldn't fully know what the full cost of the service would be. Now, the answer in terms of the full cost of the service, we would only get to that with the year ending. So to take an action to do another report, we wouldn't be able to get the same answers until the year ends itself, because you can't answer it factually, because obviously it relates to money as a figure. So we do need to see, to answer that accurately, actually how much money has been taken in from the licensing service. And then the balance to that is then the actual cost of the licensing service itself. So we need the two figures in terms of the actual cost that we're now bringing in, and then the cost of the service itself. We are aware at the moment with the figures that have been quoted from the West Berkshire element of being 290,000 per year to what's the reality now of looking at 250,000. So that is a drop, which is what's being described here, and the need to increase fees, because even with a 10%, we're on the face of it, in terms of the figures that are coming in right now, we're not getting to the break-even part. In terms of licensing fees, how they work, more customarily, where there's a local authority that stayed in place. There are years where that can fluctuate, so you can run at a surplus and so on. And then there's assessments each year to see where those fees are set. So, and then you have much more concrete data in terms of the fact that you're able to see how much income has been generated and what the cost of the service is. So it does put you in a difficult situation. Because obviously you will naturally want more information, but the information isn't really, it's impossible to completely give you that information until we've experienced a full year of the service. They were just the points I need to, just the practicalities.
Sorry, thank you. No, and I totally appreciate this is the first year. I guess the point I'm making is we're making a judgment as to how much this is going to cost to have this out. So there must be something, even if it's not concrete and based on a full year yet. Ultimately, if we are to set prices for a service that has to break even, in effect, there has to be some basis that those figures are worked out on. And as a service, you must have something. So it'd be great to see that. And if that isn't available, then maybe we shouldn't be putting up these fees until we have that first year of evidence is another option, because I feel like we are sort of in the dark. We're guessing. And I think rather than guessing, we should be more informed. Even if we can't be fully informed, we should be more informed than we currently are.
Can I just come in before? How crucial is it that we make this decision tonight?
Yeah, it's a good question. Very good question. It is that the reason why it's crucial is because we've had the early figures from West Berkshire where it's at 290,000. The income from the licensing service from September, we're obviously in October now, from September is £125,000. It is reasonable to double that to the 250. So that's the income that we're expecting, and that's lower. So in terms of the position we're describing, is that the licensing service won't be meeting the same forecast as how it was handled with West Berkshire. So it's much lower, and it's much lower than what's being proposed at around 10%. Which is a big figure, and it's a big increase, and we can't take anything away from that. But the reality is, going off the figures that we were expecting, and what we've got in from September as a real report through, that only takes you to us not getting to that standard. If we do get to that standard when it comes to April, then again the fees and charges would be set to be reviewed, and at that point you can then see how much that income has been generated, and then again a much more conclusive idea of what the costs are involved in. Thanks.
Bill, you wanted to come in, and then you, Chris.
Yeah, just to ask the question, on these statutory fees where we are set, there's no price increases. There's been no proposed price increases. Now, is this to be reviewed by these various authorities, or if not, there is still a cost element to us administering these. So has that been built in to allow for any additional costs until these statutory figures are reviewed?
There's with it being statutory, it's obviously set by the government. I mentioned that because we're in a public forum. We are not able, as a licensing authority, to set any of our fees for the non-statutory fees to balance off what are the government set statutory fees. So that becomes a point from the local authority. That becomes a blow to the local authority, and is where lobbying of government and through the local government association to central government about how statutory fees need to be set more locally. But we're not able to offset our taxi licensing trade income to match.
Yeah, I'll just come back to that. I mean, that is a cost element to us. Has that been built into what the increase, the 10%, would that cover any additional costs? Or are we now going to be in a loss-making position because of that?
It's the latter, really, loss-making, because we're not really allowed to increase one licence fee to compensate for another. So that does sort of drive us towards a position of being underfunded, which probably highlights the point I made earlier about the licensing income doesn't actually cover the costs of running a licensing service. I mean, just as an example, if you would like to look on page 23 in the pack, the Licensing Act fees, you'll see they are rather small for running sale of alcohol premises. And a temporary event notice, of which we get several hundred a year, Kieran will probably know roughly the exact figure, is £21 to send us a temporary event notice that then we have to send to the police and environmental health, and if there are any objections we have to go back to the applicant. So the £21 doesn't really scratch the surface. I believe most of the fees applicable to the licensing act was set in 2008.
2005.
2005, the Licensing Act came in, and it may well be that the regulations that set the fees were actually no later, and they haven't been increased since. From time to time, the government does say that it might consult about increasing the fees, but I'm not aware of any.
They're not doing that.
No, I'm just asking Kieran. We're not aware of any plans to review the set fees.
Chris.
This is a pretty impossible situation, isn't it? We can't really work it out. It's a stab in the dark. I mean, we're looking at a 10% increase in prices from August last year to August this year, and considering that, how that might be the right figure for the year April 2023 round to March 2024, when you've got inflation in double digits. It's a complete guess. There's absolutely no point in looking at individual costs and seeing whether they're right or not. We really have no idea. So I would imagine that when it goes to the executive in February for the budget, they may well change the recommendation because the figures are all changed again. And I think, as you said, in April, at the beginning of the next financial year, they'll have to change again. We may have to change them during that year. Inflation is a really bad thing, because this is one of the effects it has. You don't know where you are with money. I would ask, is there any level of discretion in the service that we provide for any of these licenses, or is it just a matter of doing the license and processing it? Or alternatively, is it possible for officers to work in a different way, which might reduce the overall cost? It doesn't help the council, of course, but it would help the public if we could lower costs. I don't know. Is that an ongoing consideration?
Do you want to answer that, Kieran?
I know that.
Do we? Again, as I said earlier, there shouldn't be an answer to any question that says it's impossible. So there shouldn't really be an answer that says that there isn't scope for looking at how things are done and doing them more efficiently. And naturally, we do try to be as efficient as we can and do things as economical a time factor. I think the single biggest impact on cost saving in the licensing world is computer software. I mean, the modern software applications can produce licenses in a paperless format. If it's good software, it can be quicker and less labour intensive than doing them manually. So, for example, if someone applies for a license and you let them do it online, and then all the data that they enter in their online application populates your database without manual intervention, eventually, and as we still are at the moment, the information comes in on an application form that then has to be data entered onto the database, which obviously takes quite a lot of time. And then you have to do various calculations about what the rateable value is, whether the form has been filled in correctly, whether there's any deliberate subterfuge about the rateable value and the amount payable, or whether it's a mistake. All has to be checked manually, and computer software could take quite a lot of that labour out of the process. Needless to say, the cost of that computer software will be considerable and can itself be factored in, or indeed should be factored in to the licensing fees. But it would then be profiled over the lifetime of the software, which might be 5 years, 10 years, possibly even 20 years. So that could reduce cost. And our part of the council is part of a procurement exercise which may well come to fruition in 2024 to procure new software for our service and the planning enforcement service. So
in real terms, maybe the neglecting inflation, maybe our costs can come down in the future as we become more efficient, which is good, improves the service. And when you buy software like that, that's capital, is it, I guess? It's capital, is it? And
Smart.
Pardon?
That would be smart.
Sorry, Chris, you have to switch off yours.
capital, not revenuing.
Yeah, that would be a smart approach, I think. Yeah, looking at capital funding.
Yeah, I mean, that's the direction we would like to be in, with a more automated licensing service. We are not one of the bigger authorities in terms of licensing. So, for example, Westminster City Council will issue thousands, possibly tens of thousands of licenses during a year. We would be in a cohort of many similar authorities, somewhere sort of middle ground in terms of volumes. Obviously, there's an economy of scale if you issue lots of licenses and you get lots of licensing fees to spend on computer software. But for Wokingham, I envisage it would be quite a significant investment. And unfortunately, of course, the inflation costs will be applying in the IT world, probably with some speed, as they tend to.
Rachel was before you, Mike.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just coming back on Sarah's point really about the additional information. I mean, it must be possible to do some sort of forecast. Take Chris's point about, who knows what's going to happen to the costs, but actually most of it will be staffing costs, won't it? So there is a way of doing a forecast on that. Okay, it might be out, but it is possible to do that. But it's also a forecast of the income as well, so that you've got that picture of, well, do we expect it to break even in 23-24 or not?
Yes, I would accept completely that we are in the process of forecasting our staffing costs for next year as of now, as you would expect. We have a rough idea of what salary settlements might be within a range, so we can predict with reasonable certainty what the salary costs for next year. The infrastructure costs are more difficult, as I said earlier, so I won't repeat those points, but I think that's self-evident that it's difficult to proportion accurately to one service part of the overall cost of the services overheads.
Mike.
Thank you. Fascinating. What I'm keen to understand is we have a funding say which we can't do anything with, and we have a lot of work activities associated with some of those fees, which are tiny. And we have the discretionary fees that we can do something about. It says here it's going to raise an additional 15k of income. looking at, just guessing at the figures, I would imagine the shortfall between income and cost is in excess of 100k. The hourly rate of £69 an hour must be woefully below the actual costs of putting a body on a seat and giving them all the IT and infrastructure. So we're never going to get to a break-even point, I thought. What I'm taking Councillor Kerr's point, what I would be very interested in is understanding what proportion each of the different activities costs and what portion of each of those activities brings in an income. So we have horse riding, we have zoos, we have pubs, we have taxis. Some of those are very costly to administer, I would guess, and some of them are a very quick exercise. I don't have any feeling of how that works. I don't know whether it would be possible to produce a high-level Gantt chart or pie chart of costs by sector and income by sector, so we can understand where the costs are. Thank you.
Yeah, the discretionary licence fees should indicate the amount of work involved, because that's how they're once upon a time were created, by looking at a formula for the number of hours. That data is difficult to access because it's probably done quite a long time ago, and I'm not sure we've got the worksheets that people used at the time to calculate how many hours were involved, but they are intended to reflect the amount of work involved in each type of function. I think to answer the question, I think if members had a specific inquiry about a specific type of licence, that would be meritorious of us doing some work to reveal what the background is behind that. To do it with every type of licence would be a barrel load of work for us. No, that's right. If there was, I mean, we don't have a zoo, by the way, so there wouldn't be much profit. I believe there was one once, because somebody had a few exotic animals for his own collection, but then started inviting the scout group in to see his exotic animals, and was informed he needed a zoo license. So, but we don't have an actual zoo. But if there was a specific type of license that it was of sufficient interest to members, they wanted to know more about the time element of how much was involved, we can certainly do that.
Shahid and then Pete, and then we need to make some sort of decision.
Thank you, Chair. I think the 2 points again. First is in line with, I think, Chris and Sarah has mentioned, and Rachel alluded as well. I think I'm finding it struggling at the moment to actually make a decision, because I don't have the information in front of me. What we need to see is, maybe I can appreciate the cost from the previous, when we were in partnership, but I'm sure we can estimate the cost, which doesn't have to be actual. We don't have to wait till next year. With everything we do, in business and everywhere else, we estimate this is what the cost is going to be on best knowledge, and we know what the main costs are anyway. And also we can estimate the income as well. So at least that will be something for us to base the decision on. And the decision could be, actually, it is, and we know by that how much the discrepancy is. And actually the discrepancy could be, we need more than 9.9%, right? It could be less than 9.9%. At least that will be an informed decision. At the moment, I'm finding it is not an informed decision. That's what I'm struggling to. It's just like closing my eyes and say, oh, okay, 9.9%. Sorry, this is how I'm receiving it. So I'm not sure what the others, and judging by everyone, there's probably a similar view as well. So that's why, based on whatever information you can get, estimate, I think I'll at least have something to go by. Second point, actually, use of technology. I'm quite surprised, actually, we don't use that. I mean, nowadays you can actually apply for a passport online and get it by sitting at home. And this is simple stuff. This is not something complicated we're talking about. And surely this could be automated. And based on what I know, I think 90% of the stuff can be automated. Why aren't we doing that? And also, other thing, to the cost of the IT, I think we need to look at that. Those days are gone now where you had to have a huge investment upfront. Software as a service is quite a common thing. So we use the software as we go along and pay how much we use it. And this way we don't actually end up paying, hundreds and thousands of pounds, whatever the cost is, but you pay less and depending on how much you use. This will less investment from that point of view as well. So I don't know whether we have looked at it so far, but I think there's so many different ways of, the models, the financial models are coming up from the software industry. I think we need to look at it. It will become much more efficient service. I'm sure we'll get a better feedback from our residents as well. And probably it will save us here, a lot of saving as well.
Pete.
Sorry, I'll answer your questions. So really, I'm kind of, with everybody else here, I'm kind of concerned about the balance between the statutory charges and the discretionary one. If we're spending a lot of our cost basis on the statutory and not being able to increase it, then actually increasing our non-statutory ones or discretionary ones is like shuffling chairs on the Titanic, which is basically kind of a waste of time. So I'd like to see a breakdown between the percentage of time spent on the statutory versus the non-statutory, the discretionary, I say. So we actually get to understand where our cost base is. So if we're spending a lot of money on the statutory, then making this decision to raise our discretionary is kind of irrelevant. Secondly, I'm just wondering about, is there variation within the discretionary ones to say, actually, say, for example, dog fouling, that has only gone up by £82. Actually, I think that's pretty antisocial behaviour and that should be like £200. Is there a point of actually picking on some of those and actually nailing those and actually using this as a social deterrent as opposed to just trying to make the balance of the books? And again, there's other ones I could point out. The metal recycling one, that seems to be fairly cheaply done. So I think there's some analysis that needs to be done as opposed to a blanket waiver. That's just a comment there. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Did you want to reply to that, Ed?
I accept the points completely. What's concerning me a little just at this point is the amount of work involved to answer all the points that have been raised. I believe the next meeting is January, am I right?
30th
January. And obviously work has to be completed in advance of the meeting to meet the deadlines, probably early January. And I think we would struggle in 2 months to get the level of detail that you need, given the amount of officer time that will be required to produce that. Not just mine or Kieran's, but finance officers and others who've got access to the kind of data that we're being asked to interrogate. I think I might make two suggestions. One is to perhaps narrow down the brief so that we can produce something for January, or say that this is actually a longer term piece of work, which might take longer than 2 months to do.
Thank you. Can I come in now, please? Because I'm new to this committee for a number of years, although I sat on it before and was actually sitting on the committee when it went to West Berkshire and the sharing arrangement. And I'm not sure who was the chairman of it last year. Chris, was it you? It was Barry. And why these questions weren't asked when the discussion and agreement was made to bring it back in-house. Surely we didn't bring something back into the council that we didn't know what it was going to cost us or what the implications were. And so it seems to me that we've landed ourselves in this mess because at the time the decision was made, these questions weren't asked. Sarah, am I wrong?
It didn't come to this committee, and that's part of the problem. We got a paper that came to full council, but it didn't come to this committee to discuss, and that's the problem. So there's your fundamental issue. I kind of wanted to maybe make some suggestions on what we do about the recommendations, maybe. Is that okay?
Yes, go on.
Sorry. The fundamental thing I'm struggling with, I understand the additional work and everything, but ultimately, if we are running a service that has to break even, we have to fundamentally understand the costs. So, and I appreciate that we're still working on that for this year, but the forecasting and all of that, we're forecasting income, we must be able to forecast costs as well. So that, you know, everyone should be making those informed decisions. So I'm quite surprised it will take so much work to do that, because it's got to be, this report has got to be based in some sense of information there. So there must be something there that you're basing this on. There must be some kind of costings that you've got that has allowed you to make this, because at the moment we're basing this on what the budget is, what the projected income is, and we're seeing that doing option 2, which is increasing it by 9.9%, closes the budgetary gap of income, but that's not what we're asked to actually do. We're asked to actually make it match the cost, and that information isn't in there. Now, I understand that this is quite an urgent thing, and I think Kieran said that if we waited till January, it might be too late. So I'm wondering if what we need to do is completely change the recommendation to say, because obviously we can only recommend what goes forward, you know, we are not decision making here. So maybe we need to ask that those that do make the decision make an informed decision based on what the cost is, and that should be the basis of that recommendation. So whatever that decision made is based on cost, rather than us choose one of these when we don't actually have any understanding of how that's actually going to affect things.
Can I come back to you on that, Sarah, just for a minute? I think doing a costing of it will take longer than till the end of January, because we haven't operated the service for a number of years. And if we want it to be right, we have to give the officers time to get it right. And that's doing a deep dive into everyone's time, what they've spent on, and how that works. So it may be, and I don't know whether this is legal or not, perhaps we could have some advice, we accept this report until such a time as we have better information about what the charges are and how it affects our budget as a whole.
I think the issue is that we need to make some decision, and there needs to be some groundings in there. So maybe what we need to do is take the first option, which is not to change things, because we don't have the information to change them. You see the dilemma we've got?
Absolutely, absolutely. Rock and hard place. Rachel. Yeah, Rachel.
Yeah, no, it was just say it's not about doing a deep dive. It would just be about, well, what do we expect the total costs of the service to be? And then what do we expect the total income to be? Based on estimates, absolutely. But that it's not about doing that deep dive necessarily to make this decision, although that would be good. It's about an estimate of total income and total cost for 23-24.
Okay, who else had their hand up? Chris? Oh,
So just going back to the point I made earlier, we really don't know what the costs are going to be next year. It's impossible. We have this 10% inflation. Some people have talked about 15, 18% something next year. We don't know what it's going to be. This is a finger in the air stuff. It's easy. It's easy in the sense that we can't actually do it. All we can do is just make a figure up, really. I mean, it's that bad because we simply don't know what the costs are going to be from April 23 to March 24. It's all up for grabs. So if the 10% is a reasonable figure, it's the inflation over the last 12 months. We may as well go with that for the moment. As I said earlier, the executive may change it in February, and it'll probably be changed in April again. But who knows what's going to happen? So in a sense, it doesn't really matter what we decide because it's going to be overridden anyway. We cannot determine our costs for next year because of this wretched thing called inflation.
Al?
I agree. I mean, if we overcharge, I mean, we can reduce, we can charge less in subsequent years. You know, I mean, these things sort of dodge around the real number, don't they? Stats. But I mean, if Ed said this, the costs are 290k and the income's 250k, so there's 40k missing. We had 10% on. That's only 25k, so we'll still be short, even adding the 10% on from what Ed's told us.
Right.
We're all singing the same hymn tune here. We have a financial implication of the recommendation saying that at the moment we are looking at a £35,000 shortfall on the budgeted income, and this rise is only going to raise 15k. So we know that it's going to be more expensive. We know there's a shortfall. I don't think we have any choice but to rise it by a figure based on something, CPI, RPI, whatever it is. But we do need more information to make a more informed decision going forwards. I would imagine the executives for both finance and for this particular area will want more information so they can make sensible budget estimations coming forward. So I think we should go ahead with the rise.
Rachel.
It was just come back on Chris's point. I mean, you say we've got no idea what the costs will be. We've already said that most of it will be staffing costs, and Ed's already said we have some idea of an envelope of what those staffing costs are, so we can make an estimate.
If the committee decides to narrow the focus of the information required for the next meeting to, as Councillor Burgess says, and Councillor Kerr, staffing costs, income costs, the general costs that we know because they're in our budgets. Lots and lots of lines on the budget, all the various things come out of our budget code. Yes, absolutely, because that information is kind of available on almost a daily basis to managers in my position. If we are allowed to defer some of the other more detailed inquiries, for example, the comparative costs of the previous PPP provided service, individual license types and breakdown of time elements, I would appreciate that because I think that would take more time. But very happy to bring back to the next meeting a slightly narrower set of data that we have readily available.
Okay, can we talk about what has just been said? If we want a simplified version of the costs, which is staffing costs and the main costs involved, we could revisit this in January. If we want something that is fully costed in detail, we have to wait. Are you happy, members, that we go for that simplified costing to give us a better idea of whether we're breaking even, making profit, or making a huge loss until the January meeting? Yeah, can we have a show of hands? Okay, thank you, everyone. Then, Ed, we'll go with that and bring it back to the January meeting and make sure we leave time for discussion in it so that we can make a decision that goes forward. Chris, you're looking at me. Did you want to vote against it?
Well, was that properly taken vote? Was it proposed?
Yeah, no.
I know.
I'll second it.
Thank you.
I didn't, well, you spoke very quickly. I didn't actually hear what you said.
I'll take my hat off. Right? This is making it simple. We got two choices. The choice is that we go with what Ed has said and accept the not perfect report of costings to be brought back to the January meeting so that we can make a decision which is more informed than we are now. And that work goes on in the background so that this time next year we can make a properly informed decision by having a much better report on what it costs us to run this service and whether we're breaking even, making a profit, or can all retire. Okay?
I'll second that recommendation.
Thank you. Right, can we have a vote on my recommendation first, that we go for the January option with what will be an imperfect report, but it will be more than we know now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Any against? Okay.
Thank you. Perhaps just to note that the budget setting meeting, the executive will be full council, won't it? Will be sometime mid-February, so it may sort of be buffering up to the deadlines for the full council, but I'm sure the committee is aware of that in any case.
Yeah, I mean, if it's ready earlier than that, we could hold an additional meeting just to do that. Ed, if you're ready at the beginning of January.
Just on that, there won't be much time, but ultimately we're not decision making. It's just making a recommendation
Yeah.
to the executive and full council. And I hope that they would also get those rough costings as well at the time to make that decision. So we'll all have the same information, and as a committee, we can just make that recommendation a couple of weeks ahead of when the formal decision's made.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Okay, item 16, taxi and private hire, draft policy review.
Thank you, Chair. You will recollect that I presented a initial draft report at the last meeting on the 23rd of June 2022, and that during that meeting members recommended several amendments to that draft policy. These amendments have all been incorporated into the policy that's attached into this report. A summary of the changes included how members felt strongly about the determination of appeals and the processes of appeals of officers' decisions, in that any officer decision over suspension or revocation of a license is subject to appeal to the licensing and appeals subcommittee and also the magistrates court. So some of those changes have been made a little bit more explicit in description in terms of how we deal with the appeals and also how we deal with driver revocations whereby there's been serious misconduct. So we do have legislative powers available to licensing officers to revoke a license, and that being in the public interest, which means that although there still exists the right of appeal, it would mean that they are unable to work during the appeal timeframes, and that's detailed in the policy. We've also on the input from members, we've effectively brought a change in style to the layout of the policy. We've corrected some typos from the solicitor that assisted us with creating the report, and we've also introduced a forward describing the purpose of Workington Borough Council's licensing authority. So it's become slightly more central to Workington. However, the fundamentals of the actual policy itself realistically remain the same in terms of how in the statutory taxi and private hire vehicle standards have been recognised in the policy, and how the Department for Transport recommends licensing authorities to have policies and procedures on convictions for that fit and proper person test. In addition to since that meeting in the 23rd of June, West Berkshire and Bracknell Forest councils have already commenced public consultation. So ourselves as a council, we can set our own timelines for consultation. There was lots of discussion about how we wanted to manage a consultation with the trade previously. We'll take forward those recommendations by members in terms of how we would handle that consultation. There was some feedback from Councillor Mike Smith on the report, again highlighting some typos and presentation issues which will be taken forward. And we also had a question from Councillor Rachel Burgess over a test that features in the report. So I can welcome some more questions on the policy. I also need to bring in at this point is also our lawyer, who's also identified some features that she wanted to change from the draft policy. If we've got a lawyer on Teams, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Good evening, Chair. Good evening, members. So upon reviewing this, a few final issues have remained. And when I refer to them, I'm going to refer to the pages of your agenda tonight. So hopefully you'll be able to follow where we're at and what I'm highlighting. So if I could firstly ask you to turn to page 88 of the agenda, and I'm going to paragraph 1.48 of the policy, which reads, where an applicant has a DVLA points for using a handheld mobile telephone or a handheld device while driving, a licence will not be granted until at least 5 years have elapsed since the conviction or completion of any sentence or driving ban imposed, whichever is the later. As you will probably be aware, DVLA points are not a conviction. Of course, someone is capable of getting either a conviction or points for using a handheld phone whilst driving, but that paragraph certainly needs to be tidied up, and we would obviously welcome members' views on how to tidy it up, but at the moment it doesn't particularly make sense from a legal perspective. And the next issue is paragraph 1.49. Again, this refers to 5 years elapsing since the completion of any sentence. But once again, DVLA points on the licence aren't in themselves a sentence. So those two items need to be tidied up somewhat. If members were to indicate their intentions, we could draft something up more suitably outside the sphere of this evening with a view to bringing it forward, or we could try and work on the wording now, but I would recommend the former just to get it absolutely right, if we could be clear on members' intentions. The next issue, and this will probably, okay, if I could ask you to turn to page 111 of the agenda. I'm just going to do that myself. This relates to children and safety restraints. This doesn't. Paragraph 1.65. This relates to children over 3 and below 11. It's not reflective of the law. The law on children, child restraints and seatbelts all makes reference to age 12 and or taller or shorter than 135 centimetres. So the height is correct, but we need to tidy it up and have that mirror the legal position, if you're in agreement with that happening. Otherwise, we have something which is in effect sitting outside the legal regime in that regard. And then moving on, probably not so interesting from members' perspective, but there are 3 minor points of law. So on page 116 of the agenda, we have a reference to section 53A9. This is at page 116, and this is at 1.19, and it should read 53A8. And going on to page 116 again of the agenda, 1.21 should read 61.2, and at page 120 of the agenda, paragraph 1.9, that should read 53A8, and at page 120 again, at paragraph 1.11, this should read 61.2. So those are the amendments that, in our view, need to be made in terms of clarifying the law, because clearly the clearer we can get this in terms of the law, not only do we need it accurate, but it also makes life slightly easier when we are on the other end of trying to enforce it, if the policy is clear and correct in the law. So I don't know if there are any observations about that, particularly about the first two, which do give rise to the need for more clarity. Thank you.
Did you want to comment on that?
What I tend to do is to take forward the lawyer's comments into this report before it goes to the exec member.
Okay. Did you all get that? The report will be amended in line with the legal advice that we've had. Thank you. Sarah.
I just had a couple of queries. So on page 68 of the agenda, it says 3.45 under the advertising, something we talked about last time. I still think the wording is a little bit confusing. So 3.45 says advertising on the outside of any licensed vehicle is restricted to the name and telephone number of the owner, blah, 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 blah. 3.46 then says, in addition, wheelchair accessible hackney carriages and private hire vehicles may carry all over wrap type advertising, or, it goes on to say that you can have it. So you've got the first paragraph says that advertising is restricted, and then you've got the next paragraph saying, well, it isn't. So it's a minor thing, but it would be helpful if the wording was tidied up to reflect that. Is that okay?
Yes. Okay, so being the licensing officer, I make more sense of that, and I agree from your perspective. And as a reader of this policy, that needs to be tidied up. I think what's trying to be conveyed that where there are, so not all vehicles are wheelchair accessible vehicles, but what the policy is saying is for the vehicles that are effectively on our licensed fleet, there are some vehicles that are wheelchair accessible vehicles. The most common wheelchair accessible vehicle will be the hackney carriage vehicles that we see on the ranks at train stations. So what's trying to be conveyed is that this policy is restrictive in terms of advertising at the 3.45, in terms of how we want to see advertising on the vehicles, but it's giving the ability or flexibility for wheelchair accessible vehicles, which will most commonly be the hackney carriage vehicles on ranks, for them to be able to use ramps, advertising ramps. I think the view from members at the last meeting was that you wanted to enable the licensed trade to use their vehicles for extra income. So but I absolutely accept that there needs to tidy up. But I think that's the description of what we're trying to achieve.
No, I totally understand. And actually, just for clarity in 3.46, it says, in addition, wheelchair accessible hackney carriages and private hire vehicles. So do the private hire vehicles have to be wheelchair accessible as well to benefit from that, or not?
Yeah.
So again, that I read that as wheelchair accessible hackney carriages and all private hire vehicles potentially. So there could be some confusion there. If the private hire vehicles need to be wheelchair accessible as well, that needs to be explicit, I think, because it's open to interpretation. But yeah, that just a bit of tidying up there. And the other little thing I just wanted to bring up, and these are tiny things. Well, I don't know, actually, I was a bit confused on page 109. It's 1.54, and this is about acceptable dress, standards of dress. 1.54 says trousers, shorts or skirts must be tailored and made of one colour of material. My question is why?
What are your skirts like, Shahid, then?
I just couldn't understand the reasoning. I'm sorry.
Which
So it's page 109 and it's point 1.54, the last point on that page. 109 of the agenda.
And I take it you're all minded to strike this out. It's more the
Well, I mean, unless there's a legitimate reason, I mean, if there's no legitimate reason, I don't see why that should be in there. So. The whole thing on standards of address is a really odd one because it's very prescriptive of what we're saying. And 1.5 was my biggest issue. 1.5 is an interesting one. It reminds me of going back to school where we couldn't have skirts that were too short. And I think it's about being appropriately dressed. Now, whether the 5 centimetres is right or not, I don't know. I'm trying to work out what that is. I seem to remember we used to have to kneel down and have rulers check our lengths and everything. You know, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff on the acceptable standards of dress is a bit...
it's subjective.
Well, it is subjective. I mean, the big one I had an issue with was 1.54, but I think there's a couple in there. I understand, you know, not having anything that's like really offensive written on a shirt or something. Yeah, there was the other one as well about collared shirts, blouses, polo shirts or sweatshirts must cover the shoulders and be capable of being worn tucked inside trousers, shorts or skirts. There are some really odd ones in there.
I think as a suggestion, picking up those points, if we take it away, I would suggest that we boil it down to what you really must have, like not offensive, not slogans, that not baseball caps when you're driving, that kind of thing, and possibly delete some of these more nuanced, not necessarily necessary items. I mean, there are.
It's a job for an officer to measure them all. You'd have to make them redundant.
We won't want to make anyone redundant, but there are a number of references to all clothing being clean, of smart appearance and in good condition, and that might be enough. Members are happy that we just take that minimalist view to dress standards. Then I think we can do that.
Shaheen.
That's a pretty sensible approach, right? Other thing to bear in mind is that, yeah, have some what is really essential. But also, from the office point of view, how are you going to implement this as well? It's fine having these policies, right? And so descriptive. And as Karen says, are you going to go and measure that this is 5 inch or 10 inch or 2 inch or whatever? But I think it needs to be simple for people to follow and easier for the officers to actually implement them as well. So they need to be operational. So it needs to be a bit of common sense approach. But just for my information, have we actually written these ourselves, or is that something we actually got from someone else and we just adopted them for our need?
So it's based on the original Wokingham Borough Council policy as the blueprint, and the public protection partnership with the councils that were part of that. They all contributed and sourced a leading licensing lawyer to create it. And we've taken some feedback prior on this policy and changed it to your views at this point, prior it being released to consultation. Obviously, when it does go to consultation, you'll get a bit more feedback from the trade and from the public and from agencies that are involved. And at that point, we bring back data and so on the content of the policy. But it's come from a contract basis with a lawyer that's effectively taken improvements on the fabric of the original Wokingham policy and the need to meet some of the best practice examples that have been brought in. I think that the dress code I don't think is recommended as exclusively. I think this is where it's gone slightly above in terms of trying to set professional standards for the trade. That's
what social media comments will have when this does go into public domain, especially on the clothing side. But I think it's obviously how the people are going to react.
Mike, you wanted to comment?
Yes, actually, I'd like the benefit of the opinion of our legal expert, if possible. If I could take you to page 81, general policy 1.2, not being a legal person, I'm not sure what the difference is between the council cannot review the merits of a conviction as a general policy, and then under powers, it says the council can take account of all convictions. I'm not quite sure what.
I'm just going there now. So page 81 and which paragraph are we on?
1.2.
1.2, where an appellant has been convicted of a criminal offence. That is, I think, a very uncomfortable and clunky wording of saying that what the case actually says is that if, for example, somebody turns up with a conviction for theft and they turn up and they say, well, I pleaded guilty for an easy life, or because I was told I would just get a fine or a conditional discharge, but actually I didn't do it because of X, Y, and Z. What that's saying is the council can't go behind that. The fact the conviction does exist, and it's not for the council to explore whether it should or shouldn't exist. That's what the case law says. So the council can't go behind the existence of the conviction, despite what our potential licensed driver or operator might have to say about it, where they might try and minimise, I suppose. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. I was the way I read it, I thought the two were in conflict, but what you've said
no,
is
and
that's
then
not the case.
yeah, and then obviously convictions are never spent for the purposes of taxi licensing, by reference to the need to protect the public.
Could I also ask your opinion on 1.17?
1.17, which
page 83?
Page 83. Yes, certainly. Sorry, it's far more difficult to do this on screens. Page 83, 1.17. Yes, how can I help?
It talks about evaluating, determining the suitability and safety of a particular person's behaviour. And it says that it can go beyond the general consideration and including assessment of an individual's attitude and temperament. I don't know how on earth you would measure that.
I can only speak anecdotally from matters that I've undertaken in the past. For example, if somebody, and I don't, it may be that Kieran can expand on this, but if somebody's called in for an interview with officers because there's an allegation or a complaint, if then they present to officers as very negative and abusive about the complaint and don't realise why it's, or don't take on board and accept why it's serious, that might be considered to demonstrate a poor attitude towards licensing standards. And in my view, or if somebody became very angry when they were challenged about something that had happened, for example, again, that might be an example of temperament. I don't know if Kieran can add to that in any way, but it could be down to how somebody presents themselves in their dealings with officers.
Yeah, it's just that. So to communicate through storytelling, we've recently had a case where officers have revoked a driver license for domestic violence issues. We used the disposal as the public interest measure to revoke the license immediately. So there is a right of appeal, but they effectively can't work in the interim. I mentioned this earlier. That driver didn't appeal in the end to licensing appeals subcommittee. So they've not come before elected members, and the matter is effectively dealt with. But what happened in the interview that we carried out at Shoot End offices, there was this sort of attitude of how the domestic violence didn't matter. The violence didn't matter as much because it was at home, and opinions kind of expressed in those sort of ways. So and when asking questions, about that. There has been stalling in terms of answering, and when we have looked to put the reports together about the decision making, some of those body language aspects, they went into the description of our interview to fulfil what we observed. So yeah, that's more of a sort of story aspect to it.
Thank you.
Michael?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, just don't know where to start really with this, to be perfectly honest. I mean, Mike kind of raised it earlier on with 1.3. And then I quote, and this says, this means that the council take account all convictions, whether spent or not. I think we know what it means, but if you're a lawyer, you're going to rip that to pieces, aren't you? I mean, there also should be a full stop before this means. And then when you go back further to 1.1, top of the page, you've got a new word called holder, not hold space A. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, has this been proofread? So I don't think it has.
Did we capture the specific points that the councillor was making? Yeah, thank you for that.
There could be others as well, just a lot less.
Thank you.
And it is obviously a very large document with lots of appendices, and before we put it out for public consultation, yes, it will have a thorough proofread.
Rachel?
Thank you.
No, sorry, Shahid, I've got a list.
Thank you. So a couple of points from me. Reading it through again, it really struck me how many tests we put the drivers through. So there's group driving proficiency, medical, knowledge test, fit and proper test, assistance of disabled person training, safeguarding. There's probably more that I've missed. Now I understand, of course, why we do that, but are there any new test requirements in here compared to what we currently have? The reason I'm asking mainly is to gauge any financial burden on the drivers, because I know that's something that they've raised previously. Secondly, a much more minor point, section 2.7, which is on page 53, it states, and I think I raised this last time actually, it states an application must be made in sufficient time, and it would be worth spelling out what we mean by that. I mean, I've had a case where a resident was quite aggrieved because they hadn't done something in time. So I think we're just causing problems if we don't specify the amount of time. In other areas, we say 30 days. I don't think that's suitable, but I think it would just help avoid any disputes if we clarified that.
Yeah, accept the second point, and we'll look to get that clarified for you. In terms of new tests, there are no new tests that are being put in place in this policy. But I know you have raised with me in response to this policy a question over a test, a highway code test which is in section 2.43, and that test relates to highway code features, and in the current policy that's here, the practicality, sorry, in terms of how we administer highway code tests is through the knowledge test itself. So we do the knowledge test, and it forms part of that. So it's not actually an additional test. And members in the previous meeting were not minded to have taxi drivers who are existing taxi drivers to do 6-year tests. And I think you've captured where the highway code aspects is still sitting at 6 years. So we would look to take this. We would look, as the practicality is that we now do the highway code as part of the full knowledge test itself, that we won't pursue with a 6-year standard on that as well. But the more direct answer is that there's no additional costs that are being, or no additional tests that are being introduced.
Chris?
I was just wondering whether it was advisable to display the vehicle registration plate. I don't know whether it's one of our taxes or one item, but we could be.
Right. Thank you.
Are we ready to go to the vote? We're being asked to approve the revised policy and delegate to the Director of Place and Growth in consultation with the lead member of the executive to release the revised policy for public consultation. Can I have a show of hands for those who agree, please? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Majority. Anyone? Sorry?
That's within that recommendation with the changes we've discussed, sorry. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so that wasn't actually the wording in the,
Corrections.
yeah, the
Yeah,
corrections.
sorry, yeah.
So it talked about the revised policy, but that means what's revised in front of us. We've obviously asked for some more revisions on top of that. So I just want to check that that's going to go in. Yeah.
Anyone voting against? Anyone abstaining? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michael. That, I think, concludes our meeting for tonight.
Is there an opportunity to discuss maybe the forward plan and some reports that we might want? It's not something that we ever seem to do in this committee, but we do in other committees. And do we ever get to make committee requests? Not for licensing. I've been on the committee for 3 and a bit years and I've never seen a forward plan in the agenda that we then discuss.
Kieran's just reminded me during next year we'll need to do the statement of licensing policy because it's done every 5 years. So that will need to be on the plan for next year.
So when we talk next year, we're talking financial calendar or municipal?
I think it's the date in the calendar. I think it was September, wasn't it? 2018. Yeah.
Can I just, we've got 3 microphones on. How did that happen?
We'll do it before the old one.
I guess what would be useful is we've talked about like having an action track of recommendations so we get report backs on how that's happening. I think it'd be useful if we actually had a forward plan that we looked at each time so we understood what's coming up and we could see if there's any gaps, any committee requests. And I would like to make a request, please. Now, I did email and I've had a response from you, Ed, about licensing and gambling. And this is in relation to in Woking Town Centre, brand new big Ladbrokes has opened up in a really prominent place during the cost of living crisis, which obviously is not great for vulnerable people. And I think we exchanged a couple of messages just understanding the licensing rules and what we have, but also where maybe the gaps in the law are potentially. And I would think it might be advisable for us to have a report to understand what our role is specifically around this, but also is this, you know, are there gaps in the law that maybe we as a council want to lobby on or something? Because I'm worried about the protection of vulnerable people and what our powers do and don't allow us to do. And I'm wondering if the committee would be interested in having a report like that to look at that, because I think it's quite a serious issue.
They must have applied for a licence and had a hearing at some time.
I mean, that's all happened. But my question is I think it's understanding what our roles and responsibilities are and what the powers are we have as a local authority. And if we feel that it's worth lobbying government for increased powers or whatever, the point is I'm not saying nothing's been done properly. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's the process that they followed that has been done has allowed a very prominent location of a massive brand spanking new gambling premises, which is inviting people in as we go into a cost of living crisis that will be hitting very vulnerable people and is going to have huge issues when it comes to health and mental well-being. And I'm just wondering if we should explore that and understand if there was anything further that we could do. I don't know, there probably isn't, but is there? And actually, do we feel it's worth us using our lobbying voice to see if we can get some change? And I don't know what the LGA are doing about this, if they are, what other local authorities are doing, but it just doesn't seem right that we can't seem to do anything about this. Or are there things that we could do to restrict certain things within that? I don't know, but I think it's worth exploring, if I'm honest.
And that fits with the licence that we granted, Chris, for alcohol to be served in a cafe where there could possibly be children. And I learned on that night that you have Prosecco with breakfast.
Yeah.
No.
It's not subject to the 2005 Gambling Act. We could have do the same thing they do for a premises licensing.
Sorry, don't you put your mic on, Chris?
Oh, are we starting the meeting?
Yeah, we haven't concluded.
Sorry, I was going to say it's all done by the 2005 Gambling Act.
Yeah.
So people can object. That's the law of the land. Object.
But just
Feel
because
like
someone can object, but it's about the reasonable grounds for objection. That's the point. It's the same like planning law. You know, people can object on planning, but if it's not on a planning policy or on a planning reason, it doesn't matter. But the point is how much power do the gambling organisations have versus what we have as a licensing authority? And is the Gambling Act fit for purpose? Do we think there should be changes in that law? So I think we need to understand what powers we do have and if we feel that there should be further powers to protect our most vulnerable. I'm not asking for us to have a debate now. I'm asking if we should have a paper about this so we can actually look and understand. That's all I'm asking. The point is the law has been followed and we have a problem. So because having a large gambling place open up in a very prominent location when people are desperate, which will attract them in. No, this is true. It's not view. It is a health problem, actually. It's a documented health problem is gambling. And particularly when people are struggling financially, the increase in food banks, I think this is a very real threat to the safety of our community. So this is why I'm asking that this is something that we look at. Now, you may disagree with those health facts, but they are facts.
Can we close the meeting and perhaps take this outside the meeting?
Right, I would like to make a recommendation that we have this on the forward plan. That's what I'm asking. I don't want to ignore what my request. You may decide as a committee that you don't want to see this. I'm making a recommendation, a formal recommendation, that we have a paper on this on a forward plan, please. Would anyone like to second that?
I'll second it.
Just comment on that. I think Sarah, what you said is I do agree with some of the comments you made because I know a couple of people who've been addicted by gambling and their life has been ruined and their families have been ruined as a result of that. I think what your recommendation, one thing is not clear. What are you asking for? That is, it's very generic, and I'm not sure if the offices do go away, what are they going to come up with? So I think we need to be perhaps, rather than just generic, something maybe much more specific, because obviously these laws are set by the central government as well. So what can we do at a local level? There's very limited stuff, but I think we need to maybe be clear what we're asking the officers to come back with. And that's a bit I've issue with.
I can. So I think what we need is a high level report that outlines what our powers are and in line with the Gambling Act. And I think we need to have a discussion based on that report as to whether we feel that our powers go far enough. And we have the opportunity to lobby. We have a massive voice as local government. And I think part of that report needs to include what the LGA thoughts are, what's going on with the LGA, because I presume they have a working group there that brings all the voices together about licensing, and if there's any work going on that, I think it's important to understand that the national context of this. So I think us fully understanding those roles, and have we exercised them fully? I'm assuming we have, but you know, are there other avenues that we could have explored? You know, things like, could we have some limitations on some of the machinery that's in there? I don't know. I think we need some more understanding, but it's just a high level report, understanding our powers, what the LGA is doing, and then we can discuss whether we feel that we should be lobbying for some changes in that law.
And perhaps we ought to add alcohol licences to that as well, if we're going to look at it in detail, because alcohol causes enough problems in good times, let alone bad times. We're all doomed.
The office have the capacity to do that report within the timeline.
Yeah, can we take that to the vote, please? Sarah, that's what Sarah asked for. Can I see a show of support? Anyone against? That's carried. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. There are no other items on the agenda. We don't have any other business, so I'm going to formally close the meeting now. Thank you very much, everyone. Hey.